Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Our topic today is Czechoslovak 8-bit computers.
Specifically, yeah, focusing on the 8-bit computers from Czechoslovakia.
And we're very, very fortunate to have some experts with us today.
Yes, indeed. We have Icon Mirik and Otis joining us.
All members of the SinDiKat.
Yes, that's
So welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So, we've talked in the past about the PMD-85.
Yes, we have.
But there were a lot of other computers made in Czechoslovakia.
Yes, indeed. Many, many others.
And some of them are very interesting.
Absolutely fascinating stories behind them.
So for listeners who are just getting into this for the first time, this is a great way to get an overview of all the different computers and what makes them unique.
Absolutely perfect place to start your deep dive into Czechoslovak 8-bit computing.
So let's start with the IQ-151.
Okay.
It seems to be a kind of a contemporary of the PMD-85.
Yeah, more or less around the same time.
But very different in terms of its origins.
Yeah, the PMD-85 was more of a private initiative that then later got some official support, whereas the IQ-151 was conceived as a formal state project right from the beginning.
So it was really meant to be used in schools.
Yeah, it was developed by the ZPA Novi Bor, the Factories of Industrial Automation in Novi Bor, with the specific aim of deploying it in schools initially, secondary and higher education, but with a long-term plan of even getting it into primary schools.
Okay, and it was also, of course, using the locally produced Tesla MHB 8080A processor.
Of course, yes, the heart of many Czechoslovak computers.
Now, I've heard about a terminal called the IK80M, which is supposed to be a precursor to the IQ-151.
Yeah, that's a bit of a mystery.
Is there any truth to that?
Well, it is mentioned in some historical accounts. Some of the original developers recall working on this IK80M supposedly at the EVT, which is the Czech Technical University, and also at the UVT.
Right.
But there isn't a lot of concrete evidence or documentation about it. It's believed to have had around 5 KB of RAM, and the IK stood for Intelligent Keyboard, supposedly. So there's a theory that the name IQ was actually derived from IK.
Okay, so the IQ-150 was a prototype of the 151.
Yeah, that's right.
And it looks very different.
Yeah, it's quite striking, actually. It's this metallic blue-gray casing with slots for expansion cards.
Okay.
The colors are very reminiscent of the old Trabant cars, so that kind of pale blue and gray. But it suffered from a lot of reliability problems, particularly the power supply and just general stability. And as a result, most of the IQ-150 units that were actually produced ended up being recalled by ZPA.
Wow.
And converted into the IQ-151.
So they're very rare.
Extremely rare, yes, and quite sought after by collectors.
Yeah.
And very expensive if you can find one.
Now, the IQ-151 was also intended for schools, but I'm interested in whether there was a clear geographic split between, say, the IQ-151 being more common in Czech schools and the PMD-85 being more common in Slovak schools.
Yeah, that's what the historical accounts often say, but I think in reality, it was a bit more mixed.
Okay.
Speaking from our own experience within the SinDiKat and our memories of that time, we encountered roughly an equal number of both.
Interesting.
It's true that the IQ-151 was definitely used as a platform for teaching programming.
Yeah.
Both assembler and especially the basic language.
Right.
At both elementary and secondary school levels.
Yeah.
Whereas the PMD-85 seemed to find its niche more often in electrical engineering labs or for controlling industrial processes.
Okay.
But I even remember seeing some interesting suitcase computers and some analog computers called Mega and Meta 4 alongside these digital 8-bit machines. So it was a real mix.
Now, for people who actually use the IQ-151,
right,
what are some of the more memorable aspects of it?
Well, apart from the fact that it tended to run quite warm, the most common recollections would have to be about the keyboard.
Yeah.
Which was notoriously unreliable and very stiff. So even after just a few months of use, the key contacts would often start to fail.
Wow.
So you really had to bash those keys quite hard to get them to register, and many of us left those computer labs with aching fingers. Because you practically had to lean back in your chair to get those keys to work.
Oh, dear.
And then, of course, there was the unfortunate placement of the bright red reset button in the top left corner of the keyboard.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so any mischievous classmate could easily wipe out hours of your painstaking work with a single unprotected press.
Oh, goodness.
So yeah, a bit of teasing went on in those computer labs.
But the IQ-151 was known for its modular design.
That's right.
So it was quite expandable.
Yeah, later versions could be equipped with up to 64 KB of RAM.
Oh, wow.
Which was a significant upgrade from the earlier 32 KB models.
Right.
And it could also be expanded with up to 5 expansion modules.
Oh, that's interesting.
At the back, there was a vertical bus with 5 slots,
Okay.
which again made it quite different from the PMD, which only had a single expansion slot. Unfortunately, those slots used FRB connectors,
Oh,
which were a common type of connector in that era,
so,
but they weren't exactly known for their reliability. The contact pins were very thin and prone to bending or breaking, which would often lead to intermittent connections and a lot of frustration.
so what kind of modules were available?
Well, the basic setup usually included 2 essential modules. There was Basic 6, which contained the basic programming language interpreter,
Right.
and Video 32, which, as the name suggests, allowed you to display 32 characters per line on the screen.
Right.
There was also a graphics module, the IG-151G,
Okay.
which added a 512 by 256 pixel high-resolution graphics capability overlaid on top of the text display.
Okay.
And this was a significant advantage over the PMD because it allowed for independent graphics
Yeah.
without interfering with the text.
Right.
Other modules that were available included floppy disk controllers, which were often used to create rudimentary server setups in classrooms.
Interesting.
So several IQ-151s could access shared files. Yeah.
From a central machine.
Oh,
There were networking modules that allowed several IQs to be interconnected
wow.
and connected to a central file server.
Oh,
You could also get serial interface modules for connecting to other devices,
yeah.
and even an XY4150 plotter for creating hard copy graphics.
Wow. So quite a full-featured machine.
Yeah, in terms of its expandability, it definitely looked more like a professional modular computer system than some of the other computers of that era.
Okay, now let's move on to the Andra computer.
Okay.
It was developed around 1985, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
But it had a very specific purpose in mind.
Yeah, it was actually developed as an assistive tool for the son of the lead designer and constructor, Edward Smitny.
Okay.
His son, Andra, had cerebral palsy, and the act of typing on a keyboard was intended to help him improve his fine motor skills.
Wow, what a great story.
Yeah, it's a really heartwarming story.
Now, Edward Smitny worked at Tesla Elstra,
That's right.
which was involved in various microprocessor-based applications. Yes, within the larger Tesla conglomerate.
Okay.
And when Tesla started producing the MHB 8080 processor, he initially used it to develop several specialized computers for controlling industrial processes.
Right.
Later on, when the East German UB80DD, which was a clone of the Zilog Z80 processor, became available, he collaborated with colleagues like Mr. Merkel to develop the Andra computer.
And the Andra had a rather distinctive keyboard.
Yeah, that was an interesting aspect.
It wasn't a full-size keyboard?
No, it wasn't.
How did that come about?
Well, it turns out that Tesla Fradek
Okay.
was manufacturing these smaller single-purpose keyboards for an overseas client.
Interesting.
And they had enough keys for letters and numbers, so they decided to repurpose these for the Andra.
Okay, so they just happened to have those keyboards available.
Yeah, it was a matter of using what they had at hand.
And then Tesla Liberec took over the manufacturing of the Andra computer itself,
That's right.
producing around 2,500 units in total.
Yes, and these keyboards can even be found on the control panels of NISA Sport digital clocks. So if you have one of those clocks, you're actually looking at the same type of keyboard that was used on the Andra computer.
And the Andra itself had 64 kVs of RAM
That's right.
and black and white graphics with a resolution of 320 by 240 pixels.
Yes.
Now, I'm interested in what the current status of the Andra is in the retro computing scene.
Well, just like with the IQ-151, where modern SD card controllers have essentially replaced those often unreliable Tesla M710 tape drives, the Andra has also benefited from modern peripherals.
That's great.
The most well-known being the Andra SD, which provides convenient SD card storage and even adds sound capabilities to the machine.
Right.
And there have also been enthusiasts who have been developing alternative ROMs for the Andra.
Really?
Vlada Bujic, who's a very active developer in the community,
Okay.
and especially Jan Herman, who has actually created a full Andra replica called Andra Plus,
Wow.
and continues to write new ROMs for both the original and his replica.
You mentioned the Andra sometimes being referred to as the Czech Sinclair.
Yeah, that's right.
What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, the developers around Edward Smitny actually referred to it as the Czech Sinclair because they deliberately aimed to maximize the integration of circuits in its design.
Interesting.
This was mainly to reduce production costs
Okay.
and ultimately make the computer more affordable
Right.
and accessible to a wider audience.
So the same philosophy that Sinclair used with the ZX80 and ZX81.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the PP-01.
Okay.
It's quite a distinctive machine.
It is, yes, with its brown suitcase form factor.
Yeah, it really stands out.
It does.
And I believe it came from the Research Institute of Computing Technology in Helena.
That's right.
Now, there's a bit of debate about its exact year of release.
Yeah, there is some conflicting information, but I think it was probably a bit later than 1985,
Okay.
perhaps with a slight delay in its launch.
Right.
I've even referred to it as the most colorful RVHP computer.
Okay, so what makes it so colorful?
Well, it boasted a relatively high-resolution graphics display for the time, 256 by 256 pixels, and each pixel could display one of the colors from a fixed palette.
Oh, wow.
It's interesting to note that while the IQ and the early Andra produced monochrome output,
Right.
both the PMD and the PP01 were designed with color capabilities in mind from the outset,
Yeah.
even though affordable color displays were quite rare at the time.
Right.
And in the PP01's full resolution mode, the video memory alone occupied a significant 24 kb of its total 64 kb of RAM,
Okay.
which naturally left less memory for user programs.
Right now, in terms of modern enhancements for the PP-01.
Well, thanks to the efforts of Roman Martin's brother,
Okay.
the PP01 has received some impressive modern enhancements.
Oh, wow.
These include the integration of a Sam Coupe sound chip,
Interesting.
which offers much richer music capabilities compared to the older AY sound chips found in some other 8-bit machines,
All right.
as well as the welcome addition of joystick support for gaming.
Okay.
And just like many of the other machines we've discussed, the PP01 hasn't been left behind when it comes to modern storage. An SD card reader, also developed by Martin's brother,
What?
allows for much easier access to and loading of software.
Okay, great. Now let's talk about a computer called the Maor,
Okay.
which was a project from the Research Institute of Welding Machinery in Poverello.
That's right.
And this was aimed at the home user market.
It was, yes.
So very different from the institutional and industrial uses of the IQ 151 and PMD 85.
Yes, very much so.
So what was the thinking behind the Maor?
Well, the Maor was really designed for the home market.
Okay.
It was based on a simplified single-board design derived from the PMD 85.
Okay.
And it even integrated the power supply directly into the same case.
Okay.
It also featured a keyboard that looked very similar to the one used on the second version of the PMD 85.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the developers opted for a different key layout,
Wow.
which meant that programs not specifically written in the basic language wouldn't function correctly on the Maor when compared to the PMD.
Oh, so incompatibility issues right from the start.
Yeah, pretty much.
And the video output was also simplified, likely offering only black and white graphics.
That's right.
And originally it was even intended to be simply called Pokita, which just means computer in Slovak.
Yeah, they want to keep it very simple.
Yeah, keep it nice and simple.
I personally remember seeing the Mayu offered as a kit in Electro stores.
Oh, wow.
And I was quite fascinated by the idea of a build-it-yourself computer.
I can imagine.
A friend of mine even ordered one, painstakingly assembled it,
Okay.
and then had to engage in a rather lengthy correspondence with the manufacturer to get it working correctly.
Oh, dear.
But price-wise, it was certainly attractive.
Okay, so how much was it?
Well, while the PMD 85 retailed for around 15,000 Czechoslovak crowns,
Right?
the Machiu was priced much lower at around 3,000 kots in retail stores.
Okay.
Although I do recall seeing it listed for 5,300 kots in Martin around the same time that a ZX Spectrum Plus was selling for 6,300 kots.
Interesting.
But despite its affordability, the Mayo wasn't exactly a technical marvel. It was reported to have had more than its fair share of problems
Right.
and offered less practical utility compared to the PMD, largely due to its simplified design.
Yeah.
It seems the designers might have overlooked some of the lessons learned from earlier machines,
Yeah.
and the simplifications they introduced led to new issues and limitations that really impacted its overall reliability.
Right.
I personally suspect it might have suffered from an undersized power supply, as the transformer seemed somewhat inadequate for the power demands of the integrated circuits and other electronics inside.
Okay.
Ultimately, it probably didn't achieve widespread success, partly because by the time it appeared on the market, the home computer market was already starting to see an influx of imported machines.
So it was a bit late.
Yeah, it really arrived quite late in the pre-revolution era.
Right now, apart from the commercially available computers, there are also some interesting amateur projects aimed at cloning the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, that's right.
So why was that?
Well, the ZX Spectrum was hugely popular. And there was a real desire among enthusiasts to be able to build their own
Right.
and experiment with the technology.
So what were some of the more notable projects?
Well, two of the most noteworthy were known as Mistrum and Bobo.
Oh,
The Mistrum project took a very ambitious approach,
okay.
aiming to replace the ULA chip
Yeah.
entirely with standard off-the-shelf 74 series logic gates.
Wow.
The biggest challenge with this approach was the sheer number of individual integrated circuits required,
Yeah,
around 100 on a relatively large circuit board.
that's a lot.
It is.
So what were the problems with that?
Well, this complexity inevitably led to significant issues with instability
Right.
and high power consumption,
Right?
partly due to less than ideal power distribution across such a densely populated board.
Okay.
Nevertheless, a small number of Mistrum units were actually built by enthusiasts.
Okay.
And the project was documented in the Amateursky Radio B magazine around the time of the Velvet Revolution. It's even said to have used black doorbell buttons for a keyboard.
Really?
You can imagine the typing experience wasn't particularly refined.
I can imagine.
The second project, Bobo,
Okay.
sometimes referred to as Bobo 64,
Right.
was developed by an engineer named Daneshek from the Research Institute of Mathematical Machines.
Okay.
The name Bobo was a bit of an inside joke, as it was a common nickname among engineers for the Intel 8080 processor,
Okay.
due to the visual similarity of the digits to the letters in the name.
Okay.
But being a Spectrum clone, the Bobo had to be based on the UA880B, which was a Soviet Z80 clone, or the original Zlog Z80 processor.
Right.
The Bobo was built on a large circuit board,
Okay.
which was typical for development projects within that institute.
Right.
And its ULA functionality was also implemented using discrete logic gates.
Okay.
But it utilized faster and more stable TTL circuits with a more carefully designed power distribution network.
So more reliable.
Yeah, potentially more reliable. Importantly, the Bobo offered not just the original Spectrum's graphics mode,
Right.
but also two higher resolution monochrome modes going up to 512 by 256 pixels,
Oh, wow.
as well as a color RAM mode where the entire 64 KB of RAM could be directly addressed for graphics data.
Well, that's interesting.
This larger addressable RAM allowed the Bobo to run the CP/M operating system,
Wow.
which was quite difficult on standard Spectrums due to the limitations of their display resolution for text-based interfaces.
So the Bobo was quite a powerful machine.
Yeah, it was definitely pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the Spectrum hardware.
Now, the Bobo project was documented in the Microbay's Hobby magazine,
That's right.
and a later expansion to 256 kBp of RAM was featured in the Microbay's magazine after the revolution.
That's right.
While neither the Mistrum nor the Bobo ever became commercial products,
That's right.
these amateur efforts really demonstrated the depth of technical understanding within the community
They did, yes.
and potentially influenced later designs from companies like Didactic SinDiKat.
Yes, it's quite possible.
Now let's talk about the Didactic comma.
Okay.
It was one of Didactic SinDiKat's most highly anticipated products.
Yeah, a lot of people were waiting for this one.
So what was the background to the gamma?
Well, if you were looking to get a computer for a child,
Yeah.
for playing games and learning to program, the PMD85 and the IQ151 were less likely choices.
Right.
While there were some individual imports of ZX Spectrums and other foreign computers,
Yeah.
as well as some official imports handled by the Foreign Trade Enterprise,
Right.
the quantities were usually very limited,
Okay.
often snapped up almost immediately sometimes, even by employees of the import companies themselves.
Oh, wow.
I even managed to get my first Spectrum,
Really?
a rebranded Spectrum Plus called Delta, sold through the PZO's Bila Labu department store.
Wow.
In a similar way, only a very small number made it there in 1986, and my mother, who worked there, was able to secure one for me.
Oh, wow. So you were one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, I was very lucky.
So the logical step for a domestic manufacturer like Didactic was to develop a compatible computer.
Yes.
Right. And replicating the Spectrum was probably the most straightforward approach,
Right.
primarily because its core functionality was centered around a single custom ULA chip,
That's right.
whereas other contemporary machines often relied on a larger number
Yeah.
of custom integrated circuits.
Okay.
making them much harder to reverse engineer and reproduce.
Right.
Plus, the ZX Spectrum was by far the most widely used 8-bit computer at the time, with a massive library of software available.
Okay.
There was also a significant and active community of Spectrum users in neighboring Poland,
Right.
thanks to the Unipulp company, a joint Polish-British venture that produced Timex 2048 computers, which were essentially Spectrum compatibles using a licensed ULA design.
Okay.
So in Scalica, they were actively looking for ways to either replicate or find a suitable replacement for that crucial ULA chip,
Okay.
even exploring some of the approaches taken by amateur projects like the Mistrum and Bobo.
Ultimately, they determined that the simplest and most reliable solution was to use the original Zlog ULA chip,
Right.
which was still obtainable because Kovoslužba, the state-run service organization for electronics, needed them for repairing both original Spectrums and the officially imported Delta models.
Oh, so that's interesting.
Yeah, they were still available.
Okay.
The didactic gamma was designed around the widely known ZX Spectrum Issue 3B circuit board design,
Right.
incorporating all of the original Spectrum's features,
Okay.
including the same core memory configuration, 16 KB of RAM in the lower part of the memory address space,
Okay.
simplified in the gamma to use a single 5V power supply rail,
Right.
and an additional 32 KB in the upper part,
Right.
which was implemented using 64 kilobit memory chips that, unlike in the original 48K Spectrum, were fully utilized paged in two 32 kbb banks.
Right.
However, this memory paging was implemented in the upper address space, which was a slightly unconventional approach,
Okay.
and resulted in some degree of incompatibility with certain original Spectrum software.
So you're not completely compatible.
No, not 100% compatible.
Okay.
Despite these minor compatibility issues, the didactic gamma was marketed as having a reliable design, high operational reliability.
Okay.
A keyboard featuring gold-plated contacts,
Okay.
outputs for connecting to both color and monochrome televisions,
Yeah.
a dedicated monitor, a printer, a mouse, a joystick, and even a plotter.
Wow. Quite a fully featured machine.
It was, yes.
That's right.
It even came with a rather generous 3-year warranty, which was quite remarkable for the time.
Really?
For the average user, the Gamma likely felt very similar in terms of its construction and physical size to the original Sinclair Spectrum with its rubber keys.
Okay.
And I believe the underlying goal in Scalica was to essentially miniaturize and simplify the design to create a comparable machine for the domestic home market,
Yeah.
a goal that the later Mayu project also attempted to achieve, albeit with a different approach.
Right now, the physical appearance of the Gamma changed over its production run, didn't it?
It did, yes.
So what were the major changes?
While the early Gammas were quite visually striking, featuring a distinctive red gradient on the top half of the plastic casing,
Right.
they also proudly displayed a unique didactic Gamma logo.
Right.
However, later versions saw a shift in aesthetic with Scalica opting for a more subdued and less flashy light gray plastic case,
Okay.
doing away with those initial colorful design flourishes.
So a bit more boring.
Bit more, yeah.
Now, there were also some internal hardware revisions made during production, weren't there?
That's right.
What were some of the more notable ones?
Well, as is quite common with early production runs of any electronic device,
Yeah.
some things were either overlooked or not copied perfectly from the original Spectrum design,
Okay.
which led to compatibility issues when trying to connect certain peripherals to the early Gamma 87 and some 88 versions,
Oh.
particularly those peripherals that relied on external ROM cartridges.
Right.
These initial problems were later addressed in subsequent hardware revisions. And the somewhat expensive FRB connectors on the expansion bus were eventually replaced with a more standard and cost-effective direct edge connector.
Okay. So it became cheaper to produce.
Yes.
Yeah.
A bit cheaper and more standardized.
Now, even with these changes, using original ZX Spectrum peripherals with the didactic Gamma wasn't always completely straightforward, was it?
No, it wasn't.
So what were some of the challenges?
Well, the Gamma's expansion bus lacked the plus 12V and AC voltage rails that some Spectrum peripherals required for their operation.
Right.
As the Gamma's internal power supply was simplified to provide only a plus 5V rail.
Dope.
Additionally, the physical design of the Gamma's rear case with its slight overhang could sometimes obstruct vertically oriented Spectrum interface connectors, often necessitating the use of bus extension cables to make a proper connection.
So a few little niggles there.
Yeah, a few little things.
Now let's talk about the keyboard,
Okay.
because it was advertised as being a high-quality keyboard
Oh, it was, yes.
with mechanical switch.
Yeah, they really pushed that aspect in the early television commercials,
Yeah.
highlighting its longevity compared to the membrane keyboards of the original Spectrum, which could wear out relatively quickly, especially for enthusiastic gamers.
Right.
Um, but the reality of the Gamma's keyboard was quite different.
So was it good or bad?
Well, even from the very first attempt at typing, it was apparent that the Gamma's keyboard was qualitatively and in terms of user experience, significantly inferior to the original Spectrum's rubber key or even the later Spectrum Plus keyboards.
Oh, wow. So quite a disappointment.
Yeah, it was a bit of a letdown.
And today, after 3 decades or more, very few of these Gamma keyboards survive without needing substantial repair and restoration work.
That's right.
Furthermore, the printing on the keycaps had a tendency to wear off quite easily with regular use.
Yes, it did.
Making it a notable step backwards in terms of durability compared to the Spectrum's keys, despite the initial intention of being an improvement.
Yeah, it's ironic, really.
So after 1989, Didactic Scalica launched the Didactic M.
They did, yes, in 1990.
Which they marketed as a gateway to professional microcomputers.
That's right.
So what was the thinking behind a Didactic M?
Well, the choice of the letter M in the name is actually quite interesting.
Yeah, why M?
Yeah, logically following the Gamma, one might have expected a Delta, but as we mentioned earlier, Delta was already used for the rebranded Spectrum Plus that was sold through the PZO.
Right.
And there was also a Russian clone of another computer system called the Delta S.
Okay.
So to avoid any potential confusion in the marketplace, they opted for M.
Right.
I haven't personally come across any definitive historical sources that explicitly explain why the letter M was specifically chosen.
Okay.
Perhaps Icon Myrick or Otis might have some further insight into that.
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
So the Didactic M, it had to undergo some significant internal design changes, primarily because, as we discussed earlier, the original Ferranti manufactured ULA chips for the ZX Spectrum were becoming increasingly scarce. They were needed both for the ongoing production of the Gamma and for servicing the existing installed base of original Spectrums and the imported Delta models by Koval-Služba.
Yeah, they were in high demand.
So Didactic Scalica needed to find a viable replacement.
They did.
And that replacement came in the form of the Russian UL-Astrom ULA.
That's right.
So how did this Russian ULA compare to the original Ferranti chip?
Well, it had slightly different technical characteristics.
Okay.
Most notably including different internal timing, which resulted in slight delays in memory access across the entire memory address range of the computer.
Okay.
However, it did have one potential advantage. It featured a direct RGB video output capability.
Well, that's interesting.
Unfortunately, this enhanced video output wasn't utilized in the Didactic M, which continued to use a standard pedal composite video output that was internally generated from the RGB signal.
So that potential improvement in video fidelity went unrealized.
It did, yes.
Now, for those of us who occasionally find ourselves servicing these older computers, encountering a Didactic M, or Gamma, that requires cleaning repair or troubleshooting can often be a rather daunting task.
It can be, yes.
So why is that?
Well, the passage of time has certainly taken its toll on these machines.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that's the sole reason for the difficulties.
Oh.
The quality of the printed circuit boards themselves was generally quite poor.
Oh.
Likely a reflection of the technological limitations within Czechoslovakia at that particular time.
Right.
There were several design flaws in the PCB layout,
Okay.
such as the use of very small via holes.
Right.
These are the tiny conductive pathways that connect different layers of the circuit board,
Right.
which make any kind of component replacement or track repair on a didactic board a significant challenge.
Oh, wow.
And sadly, the keyboard issues that we mentioned earlier in connection with the Gamma persisted with the M.
Oh, really?
We had hoped that this would be a hardware revision that finally improved the typing experience.
Right.
But in reality, it often became even more frustrating for users.
What was wrong with the keyboard?